Days 0 to 10. Days 0 to 10. The transformation from civilian life to military service was swift and unforgiving. Young men left their families at crowded train stations across America, Britain, Canada, and other allied nations, often carrying nothing more than a small suitcase and the clothes on their back. As they arrived at training camps such as Fort Benning in the United States or Aldershot in England, they were immediately stripped of their civilian identity. Their heads were shaved, uniforms issued, dog tags assigned, and personal belongings taken away. The military introduced them to a new reality of strict discipline and rigid schedules. Each day began before dawn with the sound of bugle calls and ended with exhaustion late into the night. Meals were eaten in crowded mess halls and usually consisted of simple rations like powdered eggs, bread, and stew. Drills quickly became routine. Recruits marched endlessly on parade grounds, ran miles with heavy packs, and were taught the basics of handling rifles such as the M1 Garand or Lee Enfield. Cleanliness was enforced to an extreme, and failing to keep uniforms or weapons spotless resulted in punishment. Instructors shouted constantly, drilling into the men that sloppiness in war could mean death. Friendships began to form as recruits leaned on each other to get through punishing days. Yet many also struggled with homesickness, fatigue, and the shock of military life. Some were physically or mentally unprepared and were sent home, while those who remained slowly adapted. These 10 days served as the breaking point where individuality was stripped away and replaced with a group identity, molding civilians into soldiers who were expected to obey orders without hesitation. While the hardships of training seemed overwhelming, this was only the foundation of the far greater challenges that awaited once they reached the front lines. Days 11 to 20. Days 11 to 20. The initial shock of enlistment had worn off, but the physical and mental demands only increased. Recruits woke before sunrise to bugle calls and spent their days in grueling routines that pushed their bodies to the limit. Mornings began with long marches carrying packs weighing up to 60 pounds, followed by obstacle courses designed to simulate battlefield conditions with barbed wire, trenches, and live fire overhead. Weapons training became more intense as men practiced loading, aiming, and firing their rifles until it became instinctive. They learned to throw grenades safely, fire machine guns like the Browning automatic rifle, and assemble and clean every weapon quickly in the dark. Instructors drilled soldiers on bayonet combat, emphasizing aggression and survival instinct. Discipline was constant. Late arrivals, sloppy uniforms, or mistakes on the firing range brought extra push-ups or kitchen duty as punishment. Food remained simple but plentiful, though complaints about powdered eggs, canned meat, and watered-down coffee were common. In the evenings, lectures covered military strategy, map reading, first aid, and battlefield communication, while recruits practiced digging foxholes and setting up defensive positions. Fatigue was ever present, and injuries from blisters, sprains, and exhaustion were widespread. Morale fluctuated, but bonds between men grew stronger as they relied on each other to get through the harsh days. Letters from home became treasured moments of comfort, often read aloud or shared among bunkmates. Yet not everyone made it through. Some were discharged for medical reasons or failure to meet standards. The remaining men felt both pride and pressure, knowing they were being molded into combat-ready soldiers. By the 20th day, most could march in step, fire with accuracy, and function as part of a unit, though they were still far from ready for real combat. The grind of training during this stage was not about glory, but about instilling obedience, endurance, and trust in fellow soldiers, qualities that would be crucial once they were deployed to the front. These days hardened men physically and mentally, slowly stripping away hesitation and forging them into effective military units. Days 21 to 30. Days 21 to 30. The training reached its peak in intensity as the men were prepared for overseas deployment. Long forced marches with full packs became routine, covering up to 20 miles in a day, leaving feet blistered and boots caked in mud. Obstacle courses grew more difficult with live ammunition used to mimic battlefield conditions. Soldiers crawled under machine gun fire while explosions shook the ground around them. Tactical drills became central as squads practiced flanking maneuvers, communication under fire, and coordinated attacks. Every movement was repeated until it was automatic. Bayonet practice and hand-to-hand combat reinforced the brutal reality that soldiers might fight at close quarters. Meanwhile, medical training taught them how to bandage wounds and carry stretchers under fire. Lectures emphasized the chain of command, rules of engagement, and the importance of discipline in chaotic conditions. As the end of training neared, Inspections became stricter, gear had to be spotless, rifles had to be perfectly maintained, and men were tested on endurance, shooting accuracy, and teamwork. Then came the orders: deployment overseas. Soldiers boarded trains bound for ports like New York, Halifax, or Liverpool, where troopships awaited. These massive vessels, such as the RMS Queen Mary or converted cargo ships, carried thousands of men across the Atlantic. Conditions on board were cramped, with hammocks stacked tightly together. Seasickness was rampant, and the constant fear of German U-boats shadowed every crossing. Blackout rules were enforced at night, with no lights allowed on deck to avoid detection. Food was basic, often tinned meat, bread, and weak tea, and men passed the time with cards, reading, or simply trying to sleep through the rocking of the ship. Lifeboat drills were constant reminders of the dangers at sea. When ships finally neared Europe, soldiers disembarked in war-torn ports, greeted by bomb damage, air raid sirens, and the grim sight of military hospitals and convoys of wounded men returning from the front. These 10 days marked the true transition from training to active service. The men who had left home only weeks before were now thousands of miles away, heading directly into a war zone, with little idea of the battles and hardships that awaited them. Days 31 to 40. Days 31 to 40. The days began with arrival in the war zone, disembarking from troop ships into ports like Liverpool, Cherbourg, or Naples that still bore the scars of bombings. Soldiers immediately noticed shattered buildings, craters in the streets, and civilians moving quietly through the ruins. The sense of danger was heightened by the sound of distant artillery and the constant presence of air raid sirens. Units were quickly assembled and moved inland by trains or trucks, packed shoulder to shoulder with gear, weapons, and rations. Along the way, they passed convoys of wounded men and medical vehicles returning from the front, a sobering reminder that this was no longer training. Once inland, soldiers were placed in staging camps where tents or makeshift huts served as shelter. These camps were often muddy, crowded, and cold, yet they provided a temporary space to adjust before moving closer to combat. Daily life included more drills, live fire exercises, and the distribution of final equipment, such as extra ammunition, entrenching tools, and gas masks. Some units were issued new gear depending on their theater, including winter clothing for Italy or waterproof gear for Northern Europe. Meals consisted of K-rations or local food, though supply lines were often stretched thin. Air raids were a constant threat, with German bombers targeting supply depots and transport hubs, forcing soldiers to take cover in trenches at night. The waiting was one of the hardest parts of this period, as rumors spread quickly about upcoming offensives and the brutality of the front lines. Fatigue grew from sleepless nights interrupted by sirens, but the men found small moments of relief in letters from home, makeshift games, or trading items with locals. Yet the reality of war pressed closer each day. By the end of this block, many soldiers had their first taste of danger, whether through an air raid, artillery shelling in the distance, or simply the knowledge that the next movement order would take them to the front. The atmosphere was tense and heavy, filled with anticipation, fear, and the dawning realization that the true test of survival was about to begin. Days 41 to 50. Days 41 to 50. This marked the moment they entered frontline combat for the first time. After weeks of training and staging, units were moved to the front lines by truck or on foot, often under the cover of darkness to avoid enemy aircraft. The first sight of trenches, foxholes, and ruined villages was a shock. The ground churned by artillery, the air heavy with the smell of cordite, damp earth, and unwashed bodies. Soldiers were placed into positions alongside battle-hardened veterans who gave quick, blunt instructions on how to survive. Within hours, many experienced their first artillery barrage. The sky lit with explosions as shells whistled down, throwing dirt and shrapnel in every direction. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook with each impact. When the barrage ended, the first firefights followed, chaotic and terrifying. Training struggled to keep up with reality, as soldiers fired at enemy positions often barely visible through smoke, mud, and rubble. Machine gun fire cut across open ground, mortars fell suddenly, and the first casualties among new recruits were immediate. Men they had marched with and trained alongside were carried back wounded or killed, and the reality of war stripped away any lingering illusions of glory. Food and water were rationed under fire, and sleep came in short. Fitful bursts interrupted by gunfire or incoming shells. Communication was primitive, relying on shouted orders, runners, or field phones strung through trenches. At night, flare guns lit up the sky, exposing movements and turning the battlefield into a deadly chessboard. Fear was constant, but survival depended on instinct, teamwork, and obedience to orders. This period was mentally and physically brutal, and yet soldiers found themselves adapting quickly. learning when to keep their heads down, when to fire, and how to keep moving despite exhaustion and terror. By the end of these 10 days, every man in the unit was changed. The green recruits of training camp had now faced death up close, and while some froze or broke under the strain, others hardened, realizing that in war survival depended on endurance, instinct, and the man next to you. The first combat experience was the crucible that transformed them from soldiers in name to soldiers in reality. Days 51 to 60. Days 51 to 60. The shock of initial combat gave way to the grinding routine of life on the front lines. Soldiers now lived in foxholes or shallow trenches dug into the mud, reinforced with logs, sandbags, or scrap metal scavenged from destroyed buildings. The conditions were harsh. Cold rain soaked uniforms, mud clung to everything, and lice, rats, and trenchfoot became constant enemies. Food came in the form of K rations or C rations, small boxes of canned meat, biscuits, powdered coffee, and chocolate, eaten cold more often than hot. Water was scarce and often had to be purified with iodine tablets that left a bitter taste. Days were spent repairing trenches, reinforcing defensive positions, and standing watch for enemy patrols, while nights brought patrol missions across no man's land or tense hours on guard duty. Sleep came in short bursts, usually no more than a couple of hours at a time. Soldiers learned quickly to recognize the sound of incoming artillery, diving for cover instinctively. Sniper fire made it dangerous to expose even a helmet above the parapet. Medical supplies were limited, and wounds that might have been survivable in a hospital often turned fatal in the mud. Despite exhaustion and constant danger, routines developed: cleaning weapons daily, sharing cigarettes, and writing letters home when time allowed. Camaraderie deepened as soldiers came to rely on each other completely. Veterans mentored newcomers, passing along lessons about survival, such as never walking the same path twice to avoid snipers or how to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing fire. Morale shifted constantly, lifted briefly by care packages or the rare hot meal, then crushed again by sudden losses or relentless shelling. The psychological strain was immense. Many soldiers reported feeling years older after only a few weeks at the front, and while fear never disappeared, it dulled into a constant background state, replaced by an almost mechanical focus on doing the next task to survive. By the end of this block, soldiers were no longer raw recruits or inexperienced fighters. They had adapted to the misery and unpredictability of the front, learning to endure conditions that would have seemed unimaginable only a month earlier. Days 61 to 70. Days 61 to 70. These days brought some of the most intense experiences, as units were ordered out of static positions and into offensive operations across open terrain and ruined towns. Soldiers advanced under heavy machine gun fire, artillery, and mortar bombardments, forcing them to crawl through mud, shell craters, and barbed wire while bullets cracked overhead. The chaos was overwhelming, with smoke, dust, and the constant roar of explosions limiting visibility to only a few feet. Squads moved cautiously from cover to cover, often suffering casualties with every push forward. Medics worked frantically under fire, dragging the wounded to safety or bandaging injuries in ditches, while stretcher bearers carried men back through enemy fire. Tank units and air support sometimes joined the assaults, but coordination was often chaotic, leaving infantry exposed. Hand-to-hand combat and close-quarters fighting inside buildings became common as soldiers cleared villages room by room with grenades, rifles, and bayonets. The aftermath of these battles left towns reduced to rubble and survivors shaken by the destruction around them. The physical cost was matched by the psychological toll. Men described the eerie silence after an attack as more haunting than the combat itself, because it revealed the scale of death. Replacements frequently arrived to fill gaps left by casualties, but these new faces often struggled to adjust quickly to the hardened group. Letters home from this period rarely described the true horrors, instead offering brief reassurances to families while avoiding details of the losses endured. Exhaustion was constant, with soldiers often fighting for days with little rest, surviving on cold rations and whatever water they could carry. Morale was shaken, but bonds between men deepened, as survival depended on absolute trust. This period of heavy fighting made it clear to every soldier that the war was a grinding battle of attrition, where progress was measured in yards and survival was never guaranteed. By the end of these 10 days, most who endured had already seen more combat than they could have imagined, hardened by fire and forever changed by the brutality of modern war. Days 71 to 80. Days 71 to 80. The war had settled into a relentless grind. Offensives and counterattacks blurred together with long marches across ruined countryside. Soldiers were constantly on the move, sometimes covering 15 to 20 miles a day on foot with full packs, rifles, and ammunition. Boots wore thin, uniforms tore, and equipment became battered from constant use. Food supplies often failed to keep up with operations, forcing men to rely on hard biscuits, canned meat, or whatever they could scavenge from abandoned farms. Hunger, fatigue, and illness were widespread. While medical care lagged behind the pace of battle, towns and villages once full of civilians were now gutted by bombings and artillery, and soldiers moving through them saw firsthand the devastation inflicted on ordinary people. Gaunt survivors sometimes emerged to beg for food, reminding soldiers that war did not only destroy armies but entire societies. Morale rose and fell with the tempo of operations, sometimes lifted by rumors of relief or a rare hot meal, then crushed again by sudden orders to advance under fire. The weather added to the misery. Mud clogged boots and weapons, rain turned roads into rivers of sludge, and cold nights left soldiers shivering in foxholes. Despite exhaustion, the army demanded constant readiness. Patrols, reconnaissance missions, and sudden counterattacks kept soldiers on edge day and night. Letters home were treasured, but many censored themselves, not wanting to alarm their families with the truth of their daily struggles. New replacements continued to arrive, often inexperienced and unprepared, and veterans had to teach them quickly how to survive. The bond between seasoned soldiers grew stronger, as trust in comrades meant the difference between life and death. By the end of these 10 days, soldiers were no longer shocked by combat, but instead ground down by its endless repetition. The war had become a test of endurance, and survival meant pushing through hunger, fatigue, and despair, one day at a time, even as the fighting showed no signs of ending. Days 81 to 90. Days 81 to 90 exhaustion had become the defining feature of daily life. Weeks of constant combat, little sleep, and poor nutrition wore down both body and mind. Soldiers moved like machines, following orders and carrying out tasks with minimal thought, as numbness replaced the sharp terror of earlier battles. Firefights, artillery bombardments, and night patrols blurred into a cycle of fatigue, fear, and survival. Bodies ached constantly from marching and digging, while infections, untreated wounds, and illnesses like dysentery and trenchfoot spread among the ranks. Soldiers grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, many admitting they felt decades older than their actual age. Yet the war pressed forward, with units ordered to attack, hold ground, or retreat at a moment's notice. Constant shelling and sniper fire meant soldiers never felt safe, even behind the lines. Rest was rare, with men collapsing in ditches or ruined buildings for a few minutes of uneasy sleep before being shaken awake for another duty. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers often became desensitized to death, stepping past bodies or watching comrades carried away without reacting outwardly. Humor became one of the only coping mechanisms, with men sharing dark jokes and laughter in stolen moments to keep morale alive. Rumors of being rotated off the front lines spread constantly, offering a fragile hope that most knew might never come true. Replacements continued to arrive, but the gap between them and battle-hardened veterans was stark. Newcomers were often terrified, while veterans moved with mechanical calm, their instincts tuned to survive. Letters from home brought temporary relief, but also a painful reminder of a world that felt distant and unreachable. Some men stopped writing altogether, feeling words could no longer describe what they were living through. By the end of these 10 days, the soldier was no longer the same person who had left home months earlier. The numbness that set in was not weakness, but a shield, a way to keep functioning in a world where fear, death, and exhaustion had become normal. Survival now meant endurance, not only of the body, but of the mind. Days 91 to 100. Days 91 to 100. This time reflected the transformation from inexperienced recruit to hardened combat veteran. After months of continuous operations, frontline duties, and exposure to constant danger, the men had adapted both physically and mentally. Daily life still consisted of standing watch, digging trenches, patrolling ruined towns, and carrying out offensive or defensive operations. But these tasks were now performed with a practiced efficiency born of experience. Soldiers had learned to move instinctively under fire, to respond without hesitation to artillery, sniper, or machine gun attacks, and to survive on minimal food, sleep, and comfort. The emotional toll of previous battles was evident in weary expressions and cautious behavior, yet camaraderie had deepened, as the bond with fellow soldiers became essential for survival. Veterans mentored new arrivals, teaching them how to avoid exposure to snipers, recognize incoming fire, and navigate chaotic battlefields. Letters from home remained cherished, providing a link to a world that seemed increasingly distant. Nights were spent in foxholes or ruined buildings, still alert to sudden shelling or raids, and the psychological effects of constant danger had created a layer of numbness that allowed soldiers to function despite fear and fatigue. Injuries, illness, and the loss of friends were part of daily life, and soldiers had learned to compartmentalize grief and stress in order to keep moving. By this point, men had also internalized the discipline, teamwork, and instincts drilled into them during training, now honed in actual combat, making them reliable and effective in ways that would have been unimaginable at the start of enlistment. Despite this growth, the awareness of mortality remained ever present, as the randomness of survival could not be ignored. By the end of the 100th day, soldiers were no longer green recruits filled with uncertainty, nor merely trained fighters. They had become fully operational soldiers, shaped by the realities of modern warfare, resilient in mind and body, capable of enduring extreme conditions, and aware that their survival depended on their skill, instincts, and trust in the men alongside them. This period marked a crucible in which fear, fatigue, and relentless battle forged a new kind of soldier ready to face the ongoing challenges of war. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more awesome content, and turn on the bell so you never miss an upload. If you have any video ideas, please let me know in the comment section. Have a great rest of your day.